Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken?
Hey, Kiernan.
Oh, Ryan, that took a long time. We just had to re-record the opening 3-4 times. Ryan couldn't remember how it went. This is episode, 139 or something?
138.
You moonlight, you go do one other podcast. Ryan, I know we're not ready to talk about it. You come back, you pretend like you don't even know this podcast. You're really pushing it, buddy.
No, it's coming back. It's like muscle memory. And, it's because we tried to record this podcast a week ago.
Oh, we did.
And our good friends at TriCast. We're not working that morning. They were like, sorry, no podcast.
I was very nervous because Ryan, I packed my mic when we went to Richmond together, which of course is what this episode is about. This is our big guide to Richmond. And it was our first trip together, which is a milestone after, over a decade of friendship. And we'd done a lot of day trips together, a lot of stuff in New York together, but we'd never done a big full overnight trip. So this is a revelation for us.
Yeah, no, this was a long time coming, And
I was nervous because we recorded an episode there because, of course, we were visiting Richmond. So we recorded an episode about Bogota because that makes sense.
Yes, that was the live in Richmond episode about Bogota. And this is the Richmond episode recorded.
And we're in Bogota right now. But you had me pack my mic, and I was so afraid that in my carry-on it had been jostled or broken, and that somehow that had messed up the recording. But it wasn't. It was TriCast.
No, I've taken this mic around the world. It's pretty durable. And sometimes I throw it. Maybe I won't have to record today, so I'll throw the mic, and it's no, it works. So, Kiernan, we have a lot to get to today because we were both in Richmond together. So we're going to have more details than ever.
Yes.
Plus,
we got to talk about the interpersonal dynamics. We broke up. The podcast was over. We got back together. It was a very dramatic 3 days.
And that was all over one drink at a brewery.
Yeah. So I think we probably should take off pretty fast just to get on our way to Richmond.
Yeah, no, because on my way to Richmond, I had to deplane and replane. So this takeoff, it could be a false start, but we'll see.
Yeah. We've already told that story on a previous show. We don't have to hear about how you sat on a plane for a few hours.
Well, why don't we tell the cabin crew?
Cabin crew, let's get this plane off the ground.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
All right. We were literally in Richmond just a couple weeks ago. But today we're back recording here in the studio. So Richmond is one of the things that surprised me, and I've been to Richmond a few times for family and work stuff, but this was my first time as a tourist, in Richmond, was that, it's a pretty big town, but the main area is really consolidated.
Yeah, it's pretty walkable if you're staying in that downtown area, for sure.
I think probably we did more walking than most people. There was a time when you and I were walking by a highway. And there was a sidewalk there, but you get the impression that it wasn't too used,
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I agree. It's mostly a driving city, and we had considered renting a car, but I actually rented a car for my first day before you had arrived, Ryan. But that was just to make it out. If you want to go visit Monticello, or I went to James Madison's house, Montpelier, which I'll talk about. Besides that, you really don't need a car if you're just there to see Richmond, which was our primary focus.
Yeah, exactly. You're gonna jump in a few Ubers, but it's pretty quick to get around.
And of course, we chose Richmond because we were looking for a getaway that wasn't too far of a flight. This was my first flight since the pandemic. So been hosting a travel podcast, have been on flight in 2.5 years, Ryan.
I was surprised when you told me that. But
remember I had children, so they weren't vaccinated until late. Let's see, in the summer. So this was kind of the first foray back out.
Yeah, no, it was you were surprised by the flight, and I remember thinking, he's back.
We had considered going to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, which would have been a great trip, but it was a very expensive to get down there. I mean, the flights are just crazy right now, but Richmond was very reasonable. And of course, you and I are both history buffs. We wanted good food. We wanted some good outdoor activities. And Richmond packs all of these things. From the historical perspective, of course, Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So a lot of Civil War history.
A lot of Civil War history, a lot of old buildings. It's one of those cities that's been around for a long time. So the architecture, it really varies. You've got houses from the 1880s, and then you've got, Richmond was occupied for a while. Then you've got, newer stuff. So it's a real mix. The city doesn't have like a uniform look.
Exactly. And you and I, we did prioritize going to a fair amount of museums while we were there, a mix of bigger collections and historical houses.
Yeah, no, I think we've got some good stuff to dive into. Do we want to get started?
I think, but given its history as the capital of the Confederacy, we should talk about the visit to something I was a little nervous about visiting, which was called the White House of the Confederacy.
Yeah, and obviously, and we'll talk a bit about it later on in the episode, but Richmond has done a lot to address their history. So obviously, Monument Avenue, which is famous for having all the Confederate generals and quote unquote heroes. Most of those, if not all of those monuments, are now gone. And Richmond has sort of rebooted the way that they present the Confederacy. And I think that was pretty evident when we went to the American Civil War Museum. So the American Civil War Museum is a series of 3 museums. The first one is the actual White House of the Confederacy. This is the building where Jefferson Davis and his family lived, basically while he was president of the Confederacy and while he prosecuted that war. He had all his meetings there. His family lived with him. It's it was, and it's at the center of Richmond. It is a very central location. So yeah, what was your impression of the house, Kiernan? What did you think?
Well, because it's called the White House, I think I had in mind that it was going to be extremely grand. And it's really not huge. I mean, given that this is where Jefferson Davis was leading the entire war, you kind of had an idea of, is there going to be a sprawling war room, a giant library? Is there going to be so many extra bedrooms where his, cabinet and advisors lived? But truthfully, it's a big house, but it's a fairly modest house.
Yeah, he had an office, but he mostly worked from that room in the front,
sort of
front
a little parlor.
Yeah, and that is where the famous Lincoln hoax. So there's this story about Lincoln.
Yeah.
This is really important, folks, because Lincoln visits Richmond a few days after Richmond falls, and this is in April of 1865, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
There's a guy named General Godfrey there. Good guy, General Godfrey. He's a Union general. He's taken over the city of Richmond, and he's taken residence in the Confederate White House because Jefferson Davis and his family have fled, right? So Lincoln, he shows up. He walks around Richmond. He takes in the sights. Probably some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. I don't know. But then he ends up at the Confederate White House, and there's been this.
I'm not sure how many sites he was taking in. Everything was pretty much on fire because the retreating Confederates would set fire to everything so they wouldn't be discovered.
This is true. Yeah. So he didn't get to eat at some of the restaurants we're going to mention. No, but he shows up at the Confederate White House, and there's this long told story that he put his feet up on Jefferson Davis's desk in his office. And, I could not wait to ask our guide about this. I was like that guy with the ghost, I was like, I was so ready to ask a question. And the guide really blew me off.
Ghost, that's a different episode.
No, I just mean that's how excited I was to ask the question. I was
you got to be a loyal listener. If you go 2 episodes back, you'll hear the story of the ghost.
Yeah. So it was. The guide really shot me down. He said, no, there's no evidence that Lincoln went upstairs. And then when I looked at the stairs, they were very slim.
And a very low railing.
Yeah. So actually, I think Lincoln would have been like, that doesn't even look like a staircase that I can physically make it up. So maybe he didn't go up there. But then the guide said that Lincoln sat in the parlor area and conferred with his General Godfrey. Mm-hmm. But that to me is basically the same story because Jefferson Davis worked out of that parlor. That's where he would meet all of his.
Yeah, but I think, Ryan, what you had painted for me, I was unfamiliar with this story, but as we were walking up the steps, you said, can you imagine this is where Lincoln came up? And, you were kind of suggesting he would have this kind of big dick energy and that he had won the war and he strutted up to, Jefferson Davis's desk, wiped all of his shit onto the floor and just put his legs up. Then took a piss in the drawer. But that's like this was like a nicely appointed home with a small table. It seems like Jefferson Davis may not even have had sort of formal desk.
No, I don't think
so. I think that's where you were looking for like, okay, so is this like where Lincoln did it? And the guide was like, oh, there, buddy. Yeah, like Lincoln took a few meetings in this room.
I mean, I'm basically in my mind, I've always imagined it as the Oval Office, but in Richmond, and a different version of the desk.
Right.
Yeah, but no, that's not what it's like at all.
And what's very, what I found very enlightening was the story of Jefferson Davis and his somewhat acrimonious marriage, from what it sounded like. Of course, they struggled with, they had many children who just kept dying, which I don't think was uncommon for the day. But also a heavy suggestion that Jefferson Davis's wife was pretty against the Civil War. So
yeah,
you have the president of the Confederacy with a wife going, I'm not sure this secession was the best idea you've had.
Yeah, she would be whispering that to all of her French friends in Richmond at the time.
Very, very strange that post the loss, the Confederacy's loss, Jefferson Davis, he only went to prison for a couple of years, and then his wife continued to be able to be about in society. It wasn't like they were pariahs, and of course they were welcomed in the South, but she continued to frequent cities in the North.
Yeah, she would go to like New York and D.C., and that to me is very Ivanka-esque. So,
Oh, yes, trying to make her way back into polite society.
Yeah. So, but she, she struggled a lot in her life. Hey, another story, though, that was really interesting was about, the Jefferson Davis and his family enslaved many people around the house. And one of those people was this guy named William Jackson. And he actually served and he was one of the sort of head butlers. He was a Union spy, and he would be listening to the conversations that Lee was having with his generals, et cetera. And, Lee had such a low opinion of the folks that he enslaved that he didn't even consider that they might be, leaking information to the Union. But this guy was, spying and bringing information back. And he eventually escaped and made it all the way up to Boston, up to your neck of the woods, Kiernan. But just really interesting to think that, in Lee's house, there were Union sympathizers besides his wife, who were getting information out there to the Union.
And do you know his name?
Yes, that's William Jackson. That was his name.
Jackson.
Yeah.
And probably the final thing in the White House for me, Ryan, was the docent who, obviously I'm a big fan of these docents who are always super passionate
I
about
loved
their
this
site.
docent. He was like a southern gentleman.
He had kind of a Lindsey Graham.
He was very Lindsey Graham, and I mean that in all the ways it could possibly mean.
And he did say at the end, they end it in the children's room, and he said, it used to be that we could show you that the children had little costumes. They had little Confederate uniforms that they would wear. And we used to be able to show, but we've gotten some humidity problems here in the room now, and I can't show it to you. And I was kind of like, don't wave these artifacts that I could have seen a Confederate child-sized costume that Jefferson Davis children used to wear here in this room. If you're not actually going to show it to me, that's such a tease.
Yeah, I mean, that's Charlie next Halloween, I think.
No, I don't think so. But I do think it did humanize Jefferson Davis in a way that I have to, having learned Civil War in New England, I don't think that I ever saw the Confederate leaders as actual real people. And there was enough personal detail about his life and his family that it did push you a little further to think about who these people were and how crazy the decision was for them to try to take on the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely insane. So down the road, there's another museum that's part of the American Civil War Museum collection, and it's historic Tredegar. And Tredegar was, both of us, we should say that we didn't think the museum was great. It's new, it's well curated, but it wasn't very easy to follow. Like it was, they didn't have like sort of a lot of high level information. It was a lot of, the personal stories. It didn't have that many artifacts really.
It was very it felt like a new museum. It was kind of packed with audio visual, and it had a very nice opening video presentation for about 20 minutes in a brand new theater. It just all feels very new, but it also feels a little Disneyfied, I would say, like a little too polished.
It's a little too polished. It has most definitely been recast to tell the story from many perspectives, right? So they really do bring the northern perspective, the perspective of the enslaved people of the Confederacy.
Many stories of women's contributions to the Civil War.
Yeah, young people who didn't have any, didn't own any slaves, who went off to war to, because they were sort of caught up in the Confederate fervor, So it does tell a lot of those stories, and those are interesting. But I wish it had told like a better sort of like meta narrative.
Yes, it doesn't have a single cohesive story that it tells. It feels very much like a grab bag. It feels like you could kind of picture a conference room where there were, here are the 3,000 stories we're considering, and now we're just going to kind of choose the 100 we actually have space for or an artifact to bring to life. And there were stories that I had never heard before, but they just didn't seem to kind of plug together. And it didn't. If you weren't super familiar with the broad trajectory of the war, it didn't even really give you a very clear timeline as to where those smaller stories fit.
Right. You wouldn't really understand like where in the war what was the context of this person's contribution, because you would have to know like, okay, in this year the Union was ascendant, or this was a time when the South actually felt like they were making, having momentum. I mean, the war had like its ebbs and flows. So one of the stories that I thought was really fun was Sarah Edmonds, who was she was like a lesbian spy. She was like
for the North.
For the North. Yeah. No. God, for the South, that'd be really reactionary.
Very surprising.
It's contributions like this woman who she dressed like a man, and that caught a lot of attention in the day. But it's very clear, that she, she was a member of the LGBT community, and they even give that side of the story. So that kind of stuff I really enjoyed.
Yeah, one thing that I took away was there again, some of these smaller battles. I'm not a Civil War expert, though I'm interested. And there was a story of a battle called the Battle of the Crater that I had never heard of, which was basically that the Union troops dug a tunnel underneath this battlefield where they were going to confront the Confederates, and they packed it with gunpowder, and then they backed off. The Confederates came forward and they lit it, and this huge explosion happened, creating a crater that even the Confederates that were still alive after the explosion fell into this crater, and then they basically went in and shot them and bayoneted them. So it was really crazy. That was one of the story that I would have heard before, but I had never been familiar with it.
And then on the Union side there, that was I think it was one of the early battles with an all-black regiment.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah,
I remember they were the first sent into the crater. So for tids and bits and pieces that you might not get in every Civil War history book, it is good. There's also an interesting room about how the Confederates were trying to muster support from overseas. So there were actually diplomatic missions from the Confederacy to try to convince other countries to give them especially financial backing. Again, that wasn't a story I was super familiar with. There's quite a deep dive. I think it was probably a temporary exhibit around how the North and the South each financed the war, and how the move to a single national currency was really pushed by the debts that were being accumulated during the war. And I didn't really, in the Union, they were called greenbacks, and in the Confederacy, they were called graybacks. So even in those namings, they were like, they have greenbacks, we're going to call them graybacks. Y'all, that's my Southern. I'm throwing in Southern so you know which side I'm representing.
But one thing about the museum that was cool was the actual building and the site that it is part of, which is this old factory, which is one of the largest iron plants in the country at the time. And then when secession happened, it was one of the reasons, the existence of this facility was one of the reasons why they decided to base the capital in Richmond, because this was where they could build a lot of their weapons, a lot of their cannons. This factory produced the ironclad warship, the CSS Virginia. So their limited naval resources came out of this factory. So in a war where the North having so many factories really contributed to the ability to win that war. This was a really important site, and it was one of the first places that the Union lit on fire when they came into Richmond.
And so the Civil War Museum, I think if you only have limited time, we would both recommend the White House of the Confederacy over the Civil War Museum proper, but certainly worth an hour and a half. And it's in a very interesting stretch of river where if you do the canal walk, it will bring you right by the museum. So if you just want a break and some AC, worth going into.
Yeah, and you got to do some of that canal walk, right?
Yep, I did a fair amount of the canal walk. If you get good weather, which Richmond often has temperate weather, that's definitely the outdoor thing to do. You and I had a beautiful fall day while we were there, Ryan, and so we decided to take advantage, not only going to the canal walk, but also taking in the Hollywood Cemetery.
Yeah, the Hollywood Cemetery.
Honestly, that wasn't on our original itinerary. It was the docent at the Confederate White House that suggested it. He said today would be a wonderful day to go visit it. And I was a little skeptical, but I'm really happy we made the time.
Yeah, so we had to run over there to get there before what we assumed they were closed, right at dusk.
My history of getting locked in cemeteries.
I know. So it's this is right on the banks of the James River. It's big. It's like 135 acres. In fact, you and I were only there for like an hour or so. So there was a lot more area that we could have seen. But it was cool walking up to that big area where the presidents are buried. What is that? The Hill of the Presidents?
Yeah, there were. It's a very beautiful. It's almost an Olmsted-esque cemetery. Lots of different layers, lots of hillsides, winding roads. So it's got almost a naturalistic park layout. So we went there to go see primarily three graves. One was James Monroe, who had a beautiful grave that was basically part greenhouse, part sculpture, part mausoleum. It was kind of perforated through stonework, and so it looked very light and airy. It was almost like a chapel. Yeah,
it's known as the birdcage.
I can totally see that.
Yeah, and it's actually. It's very unique, and it was actually landmarked in 1971 because of how unique it is. So that to me was a real surprise. I was expecting a much more sort of kind of traditional, stately, but this had some kind of flair to it.
Yeah, this was a model I'm hoping to put my grave against if I make it.
Yeah, it's an aspirational grave for sure.
And then President John Tyler, one of the lesser known presidents, is also there. So we stopped by him. And then it's also the resting place of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And I think you and I were both wondering, is this going to be kind of a creepy monument? Is this going to seem inappropriate? And Jefferson Davis, they actually give a fair amount of real estate there. And he and his wife were both married there. And there is a statue of him, but I was very pleased to see that there was, that nobody's leaving artifacts there. Nobody's leaving flowers there.
I have to say, I was surprised. I would think that statue would be defaced both positively and negatively, right? Yes, it is interesting to me that has, and maybe it's something about it actually being his grave and not like a big monument of him out on the street.
Right. Yes, I agree with that. It's also not, it's not given a particular place of prominence. You have to go pretty far into the cemetery to find it.
And I noticed, and maybe I'd like to think this was intentional, but his grave is staring at another grave across the little way there of a person named Grant. So
it's not the
no,
Grant,
it's not the Grant, but I do hope that whoever was doing the design back then thought that was funny. Always looking at Grant for the rest of the time.
So that was a nice place to take an afternoon and kind of decompress. But heading back into the museums, we also stopped not only into the history museums, but Ryan, this was really something that you wanted to spearhead, was the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts.
Yeah, I had heard a lot about the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I'd never been before, but it is a really well-known collection, and it has nearly 50,000 works of art. And what's interesting about this is that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts is the 14th largest museum in North America. Now, just think about that, because think of the cities that are in North America, right? You've got Montreal, you've got Mexico City, you've got LA. I mean, there's some incredible museums. New York. So they've got it's a huge museum, considering that Richmond's the 43rd largest city in the country. So it surprises you with, I think, just how big this museum is.
Yeah, I thought I was also surprised by some of the quirkiness of the collection. So, for example, they have a huge gallery devoted to Fabergé.
Yes, and this is all thanks to some rich lady, Lillian Thomas Pratt, who died and left her entire collection of Fabergé and other Russian decorative arts. I was always under the impression that Fabergé mostly made eggs, but there is like this cute little sailor figure and all this other stuff.
And some large pieces of furniture in that Fabergé style too. So it was surprisingly interesting. You can tell that it's one of those collections that represents a lot of individual personalities who were private collectors and then left their collections to the museum.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's beautifully presented, and there's a lot to see in this museum. It's one of those, I like to call them like a mini Met. It's got like a little bit of everything.
Particularly, I really like the classics galleries, but it's a relatively small collection on that front. But one thing I really liked there, and I always have an eye out for this because my wife was a classics major, was they have there's only 2 surviving full body statues of Caligula, because he became such a hated emperor. They were all destroyed, and just a couple eked their way out, and one of them is right there in Richmond.
Yeah, that was pretty fantastic, the Caligula statue. Another more recent acquisition is they have Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War. This massive sculpture of a black man sort of dressed in like sort of military, old school sort of like Victorian military uniform, on a massive horse, and it's a really in a neighborhood, in a city, known for its men on horse monuments. I think it's the perfect place for this statue to live is in Richmond. In front,
that you don't even have to go in the museum for.
Yeah, that's right there in front of the VMA. You can't miss it. And it's a real, and I'd seen it before in Times Square, when it was kind of on tour before it settled at the VMA. And I just remember being struck by how incredible it was, and to see it again in front of the VMA, it's a real centerpiece. So folks should check that out.
And I think especially striking because it's outdoors there, and the rest of Monument Avenue is basically empty because so many of these Confederate statues have rightly been taken down.
No, exactly. And you've got, Monument Avenue, it needs a refresh. There's a lot of good people who could, I'm a big fan of monuments, the idea of recognizing people and communities, telling stories over time. So use that space, Richmond. Let's get some new stuff there. I know they've got a statue of Arthur Ashe that I remember seeing as a kid, that's been up for a long time. He's a famous tennis player, local Richmond resident. We should do more, former Richmond resident. They should do more things like that.
Yes. And so once we moved on from the art museums, we did a few house museums. And this one I think that was great for us, Ryan, but you'd have to be pretty into American history to want to add this to your itinerary, was the John Marshall home. So this is John Marshall, a famous Supreme Court justice. Also, I had not realized he was also a congressman, and he was Secretary of State to John Quincy Adams. So one of the few Americans who have served in all three branches of government.
Yeah, he was an impressive guy. I learned it's interesting to go to a house of a figure like this, because I've always read John Marshall has always been sort of in the background of histories that I've read. So to really spend that time with him and to learn about his life was very cool. And the house is really well preserved.
Very well preserved, and he's most famous for overseeing Marbury versus Madison, which came up with the concept of judicial review, which makes basically the Supreme Court the last stop on constitutional decisions. And the house itself, I found that you learn a lot more about how political he was, right? Because sometimes in today's world, the court, well, today it's very political, but I think the ideal is that it's supposed to be outside of politics. But John Marshall came very much from politics, and there were a lot of stories about his acrimony with Thomas Jefferson. And, he was very much a man about town in Richmond and in Virginia politics, especially.
Yes, he was incredibly involved in all levels of politics. He also had a tragic situation with his wife.
That's right, Mary.
Yeah.
So Mary is, I actually wanted more, and we drew out the docent quite a bit on Mary, because a pretty tragic case, which is basically on the death of one of her sons. She sunk into a deep depression that seems to have lasted for 20 years. And John Marshall, being a big, a top citizen in Richmond, had to sort of navigate having a homebound, very ill wife, and being a highly public person, going back and forth to the Capitol and out in Richmond society. And one story that just really struck me was she used to suffer from horrible headaches, and the idea of any sound would just really set her off. And John Marshall had to pull a bunch of strings in order to get all the churches of Richmond to muffle their bells so that his wife wouldn't be given headaches.
That's when a guy has power, when he can literally silence the church bells.
And again, this was one of the, it was actually not different from the experience at the White House of the Confederacy, where John Marshall just was one of those historical figures that I think had in pop culture, we've never really had a humanization of him, but it made you realize, he was navigating family, he was navigating difficult times, and of course, his professional trajectory.
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting place to see.
But you've got to be pretty interested in, hearing about John and Mary Marshall's decorative preferences.
Yeah,
if you're limited for time, I would say the next historical house we're going to talk about is a must do, and this is a nice to have. And they do highlight some of the stories of the John Marshall slaves and where his income came from, and they do give the context there, though I actually thought they could beef up that part of the presentation. I sense that it's maybe from a lack of historical research that they're still trying to unearth these stories around John Marshall. But Ryan, the house that I thought was the hidden treasure that we found was the Maggie Walker house. And I was not familiar with Maggie Walker. I don't know if you were.
No, I wasn't before, but wow, what a character.
I mean, an amazing person. Maggie Lena Walker. You see her name on a few streets, and there's a statue in a little plaza that's devoted to her. But the National Park Service preserves her 28-room mansion in Richmond. And so we went not knowing much of the story, but she was a black woman who descended from slaves, and she was the first African American woman to found a bank. She was a newspaper editor, and she ran these fraternal societies that were key to organizing and bringing together the black community. And her her basic passion point was saying to the Black community, we live in a deeply segregated place. We should not be reliant on white businesses that don't even want us in. So we're going to found institutions like banks and newspapers to lift ourselves up, to create Black-owned businesses, and that's where the Black community is going to spend our money.
Yeah, as a woman and as a Black woman, to accomplish the things she did in her lifetime, it's really staggering. At the time that she did it.
Yeah, and she was most active from the 1890s up through. I mean, really right up through her death through in 1934. She became a pillar of the community, and she accumulated enough wealth that she built this quite extraordinary house, and it has that kind of sprawling feel of somebody that was adding on as her family grew, as her wealth grew, and probably you do get a great sense of who she was and who her family was. You know, she later in life had mobility issues, and she didn't want to use a standard wheelchair. And so she basically took an easy chair and drilled a bunch of holes in it and put some wheels on it. And that was her wheelchair. And she just was very much her own person. That's something that I think comes across over and over in the National Park guided tour there.
And all the way until the end of her life, she remained super involved in the community. So like one of the reasons why she wanted that chair is that she's having people in the house all the time. She's involved in, so many causes. She's got people like living in the house with her. And there was another sort of cool feature. She had built a big steel elevator. Because she refused to move her bedroom to the first floor because she wasn't going to let anyone tell her where her bedroom was going to be. She's like, no, I'm keeping my bedroom on the second floor, and then installed an elevator in this house. And
it was basically just a cage that her son had to pull.
It's like a manual pulley,
to bring her upstairs. But that's where Maggie wanted to live.
And I can only imagine, because that did not look like a light wheelchair. So I feel like he was a very strong man.
And, she experienced a fair amount of tragedy in her life. Clearly, her people were oppressed by white society, but also quite tragic. Her son accidentally shot her husband, his father, thinking it was a thief breaking into the house, and she survived that. I mean, just lots of fascinating stories here. And again, in contrast to the Civil War Museum, put in the context of a much bigger movement. I think that's what I loved most about this house. So they're actually, we'll link in the show notes, the National Park Service, the local staff there put together a biographical video that captures a ton of what you learn at the house. So we'll put that in the show notes for you to watch. Definitely worth your time.
There was this really funny moment on the tour where we get to her bedroom, and we're near the end of the tour. And so there's these two little girls, these like adorable, 5, 6, 7-year-old girls that are there on the tour with their mother. And Kiernan asked, well, tell us about the murder. And the docent's like, well, I don't usually talk about the murder when there's children around, Kiernan. And then proceeded to...
Hey, it's history. Listen, man, it's history. I needed to hear more about that.
Yeah.
They were just going to skip over this major story.
So we made the girls, I think they started weeping, Kiernan.
History can be dark, Ryan. We also made time after Maggie Walker's house to head over to the Virginia State Capitol, which has been the home of the Virginia General Assembly since 1788. And obviously, there's been lots of changes since then. But the basic design of the place actually follows a model of a Roman temple from the south of France. And it was designed by none other than, one of the 5 people who seems to be everywhere in history at this time, Thomas Jefferson, of course. And that classical model of looking at Roman buildings with giant pillars, triangular roofs. This is, something that defines our public buildings through to today. And the Virginia State Assembly at that time was what sort of set that precedent.
Yeah. They had a really interesting, little miniature model that was used by the actual crew that made the building. So they're looking at this model that Jefferson had made, and they can actually tell from the model the various colors of the the various colors that the Capitol used to be painted, right? So each time the Capitol was painted, they'd repaint this model, and they've gone back and they've been able to peel back those layers and see the various shades. So that's a really cool thing. I have to say the thing that most struck me about us going to the Capitol was the Society of Cincinnati was holding a meeting there. And we were in the elevator with this. We were in the elevator with this man who had these huge mutton chops, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, is there a ghost? Are we with a ghost of a Confederate general or something like in this?" In the elevator, and it turns out no. Worse than that, we were in the elevator with a man who belonged to the Society of Cincinnati.
Well, and we weren't familiar with the Society of Cincinnati, and the docent at the that showed us around the Capitol was a little eye rolly about it. But it is a hereditary society for people whose great grandfathers served in the Revolutionary War under George Washington.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of
most of these families peaked in, I'd say, 1776, 1777.
And they were having a meeting there, and Ryan and I were they like very ceremoniously closed the doors to this, for those who aren't in the society. And we were just saying, like, what are they doing there? What activities does the society do? But I do like the story of Cincinnatus, who was a famous Roman general who led to victory and then returned to his life as a quiet farmer, and that's why George Washington used to be known as the American Cincinnatus, because he always saw himself as a farmer, and of course he's the person who stepped down from the presidency, who famously after 8 years stepped aside and showed that transition of power could happen and returned to the farm. And of course, that's brought to life in the Virginia state capitol with a famous, they say it's the most expensive marble statue in the United States by a French sculptor named Houdon. And Houdon did a full body, and Washington was quite tall, quite imposing sculpture of him. And he's in his military uniform, but he's leaning on a plow. And so this speaks to that two parts, the military leader, but also the farmer and civilian.
Yeah, that's a very cool sculpture, and well worth seeing that one. And then, if I remember correctly, there's one of the I almost said the Marquis de Sade, which would be
very strange,
very different.
You're thinking of Lafayette.
Lafayette, yeah, Lafayette. There's a statue of Lafayette there, and
there's a bust of Lafayette, and then a bust
Monroe.
Any Virginian who has been a president is represented.
Yeah. And, it's a beautiful capital.
Yeah, and you don't have to go on a formal tour, though we did. You can see all those pieces just by going through security, and you're able to do a little self-guided tour if you just have 25 minutes to stop in.
And you can see the governor's office. You can, it feels very accessible in a way that not a lot of state capitals do.
Well, it's a very small state capital compared to others. And Ryan, I just wanted to talk about one more thing. I did rent a car and make my way out to Montpelier, and I want to dive deeper into this in a future episode. But if you do have an extra hour and a half to go out and see some of the historical sites, James Madison's house, Montpelier, far overshadowed by Monticello. And if you can only make one, I'd say go to Monticello because there are more stories there. But James Madison and Dolly Madison are an interesting couple to learn about. I think they too do a great job of bringing to life the story of the president and his family, but also the slaves who served them. And the few things that I think just were reinforced for me by visiting Montpelier was, the Constitution would not have happened without James Madison. He is the father of the Constitution, and you can visit at the home, the library, where he basically holed himself up, studied constitutions and politics from around the world, and came up with the Virginia plan of representative democracy that then became the Constitution. And you do get a sense of Dolly Madison as sort of a partier and a beloved figure of her time. And a lot of hints of the other founding fathers and mothers around the house, lots of busts, lots of paintings, to give you a sense that this place was a destination. It was a place where many stopped on their travels to spend a few days. Probably the most striking story that stays with me is a story of James Madison's right-hand man who was enslaved, named Paul Jennings. And Paul Jennings, there's actually a picture of him, a photo of him, and he's holding a book in it, which was very important because at the time it was actually illegal in Virginia to teach slaves to read. But Paul was rightly very proud that he was learned, and so he held a book. And he apparently begged for his freedom, if not during James Madison's life, then in his will, but he was not freed. And Dolly Madison, who survived James Madison, kept him enslaved and then finally gave in and sold him to an abolitionist who then let him be free. Couldn't even free him properly, decided to get paid and then have him be free. And he kept in touch with Dolly. He did quite well for himself in business. And as Dolly aged and was having financial struggles, he actually gave money back to Dolly Madison, back to his enslaver. It's an incredible story. So I'll put a couple links in the show notes to more about Paul Jennings' history.
Yeah, please do. And I was sorry to miss that, but as you all say, reason to go back.
We can't wrap up our Richmond episode without talking about some of the great food we tried.
Yeah, we definitely had some pretty good food there in Richmond. I was impressed.
I'll say I want to give credit where credit's due. Eater has a great Richmond list. So that's really where we started our research. And I have to say, it didn't disappoint. A lot of their recommendations really deliver. So we'll post in the show notes a link out to Eater if you're planning anytime soon.
Yeah, Eater's always a great resource when you're traveling. I don't know how they do so many cities, but they've got some serious coverage.
Totally. So, we should probably start with breakfast with Ryan. I don't believe you went to breakfast at all while we were in Richmond, did you?
Well, we had brunch together.
Yeah, we did have brunch together. It was okay.
Yeah, it was okay. It was pretty good. Yeah.
That restaurant was not top of my recommendation.
Yeah, but I had that breakfast chimichanga.
I know it was large and fried.
Yeah, I think it's still in my stomach from 3 weeks ago.
Oh my God, that is really revolting. Well, on the mornings that we were there, Ryan, where you didn't care to join me, I went to a fantastic bakery. This might be my top most unique Richmond restaurant recommendation. It's called Sub Rosa, and they're known particularly for the giant wood-fired stove that they have in the back, and you can watch as they shove in different pastries and breads, and it looks just amazing, and you can really richly smell the wood in the bakery.
I do like the smell of wood in a bakery.
It's I've heard you like the smell of wood in most contexts. And it also has a great coffee bar and cappuccinos and lattes and really great. I picked up as a present for my wife, who of course was watching the children for me, so that allowed me to take this trip. And thank you, Catherine, by the way. And thank you also to Catherine's parents for helping with the kids during that weekend. They have a special coffee blend that you can buy there. So I got the whole beans, and she was able to live the Sub Rosa experience here in Boston.
And that's the place that you went without me, because I wouldn't wake up early enough.
That's right. You wouldn't wake up early enough. It does get a decent line. So you want to go, if you can manage it, go before 9:30 in the morning. And what's nice is, unlike the many bakeries and coffee shops in New York, once you're in, there usually is actually a place to sit and stay. So I got my New Yorker, and my pick for things to eat there would be the fig and cheese croissant. That was killer.
The fig and cheese croissant. That does sound good. I love fig.
And in addition, Ryan, before you joined me, I had that afternoon where I went to Montpelier. It was I made time to go to a Jewish delicatessen that it has the feel of like it used to be kind of your classic greasy spoon, but has gotten some attention, and they fancied it up a little bit. It's called Pearlie's, Perlys. And Pearlie's, it has very comfortable booths, a nice bar that you can belly up to. It does have a decent wait, but as a single person who was ready to go up to the bar. They got me right in. And I had just a killer sandwich I'm still thinking about called the Shapiro Schnitzel, which is breaded schnitzel, and it had it also had this. It's called Zug sauce. I don't know if you've heard of it. I believe it's a Yemeni spicy sauce that played really well.
It's like a yogurty sauce.
It's no, it's not yogurty. It's very herby. But it's fiery also.
Yeah.
But it's spicy also. It has a real kick to it, and it cut nicely against the meat. So I real highly recommend. You would have loved Pearlie's. I was sitting there digging into this sandwich, thinking about how much I wish you were there.
I am like a schnitzel fanatic, so I would have definitely enjoyed that. And you told me, in your defense, you did tell me to go there on that Monday, but I wasn't able to make it.
I was hoping you'd make it, but you didn't get there, eh?
No reason to go back.
Reason to go back. And I like schnitzel too. So much that they used to call me Schmitzel. That's not true.
I'm going to call you that from now on.
We tended to go a little bit fancier with our dinners. We like a long, leisurely, often alcohol-fueled dinner together.
Yeah. So we had two really good dinners. We'll start with the first, which I think we both liked, but then I'll let you take the second, which we both really liked.
Perfect. Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, the first was Long Oven, and a Long Oven is named after a kind of oven that used to exist that was like in the center of town, and the whole community would just go like cook their stuff in this oven.
Yeah, it's like a big communal oven.
A big communal oven, and Long Oven's a better name for it than big communal oven.
Big communal oven, yeah.
Yeah, and this was a pretty fancy. A fine dining restaurant. We did the tasting menu, which was very nice. And I'm just trying to remember if there were things about it like that. I remember it being like a very pretty romantic for us.
It was romantic.
It was
you were
romantic.
Making fun of my shorts a little too much for me to find real romance in the air, though.
Yeah, well, I've never been on a date with a man in shorts before.
It was hot. It was very hot.
It wasn't hot. It was hot
warm-ish.
During the
day. It had gone down. I just wanted to be comfortable.
But Richmond isn't like Puerto Vallarta. It's not Miami. So it's like
So,
but they did they do let you in shorts. So that's one thing. That's one thing.
Well, they saw money,
Yes, they did.
Because we had committed to the prefix menu, which is an expensive. You actually have to book it before
you have to pay in advance for it. That's exactly right.
So we had the 10 course small dish tasting menu.
But filling. Pretty
It
filling.
was filling. Listen, I thought it was good. I didn't think anything was so memorable that it necessarily qualified for the price.
I think it's a little expensive.
Yeah, a little expensive. But the ambiance, they had a really nice little outdoor deck or porch area that we would recommend. So maybe it's more a place to go get a drink and a glass of wine.
Yeah, no, I think that would be you'd be very satisfied with that. And the service was fantastic. Everybody was so nice.
Yes, that's true. The real standout dinner spot, though, I would say, was Restaurant Adara, Adarra. And the idea is that it's Basque-influenced tapas. So very Spanish, garlic heavy, sort of bready, brothy, paprika-y, and so easy to build a delicious meal for any palate. We explored some of the seafood options, and we drank enough wine that I think we each regretted it the next day.
I didn't regret it.
Well, you didn't have as early as a full.
No, I even went out afterwards. But
that's true. Right.
But I think a natural wine menu, which I enjoy. The tapas. We had a great selection of food. I left there just feeling really just like stuffed and happy.
Yes, that's how I felt too. And tapas doesn't always leave you that way. But we probably just ordered correctly.
Yeah, no, we got to try a fair amount of that menu. So that was a very unique find. And if someone asked me like, I'm going to be in Richmond for one night, where should I eat? This is a place that I would point them. And they get a big shout out in Esquire as one of the top new restaurants in 2020. So folks have noticed this place. It's not a secret.
One more place I would plug, Ryan, is if you're in a rush and you're, just trying to hit the tourist track in Richmond and you just need something quick and filling, I really liked, there's a local chain there called Soul Taco, and it's really kind of clever, playful taco combinations. And it was the only place open late night when I got in. And so desperate for something before I got to my hotel, I found a Soul Taco nearby. Really, really liked it. It's like, it's a cut above what you expect a faster food experience for tacos to be, and super creative. Probably one of my favorites was there was a buffalo cauliflower taco that was really, really solid.
Buffalo cauliflower is one of my favorite veggies to order at a restaurant. So I've never had that as a taco, but that sounds fantastic.
I mean, I bring some expertise here, Ryan. I was chief marketing officer of a vegetarian restaurant.
It's true.
Restaurant
it's true.
chain. So there's a Soul Tacos right up my alley, and a big shout out fans up here in Boston.
Oh, fantastic. Now, should we talk a little bit about the nightlife that you and I explored? And by that, I mean the one beer we had, because Richmond's a brewery. It's a brewery town.
It is a brewery town. Lots of good brewery places. However, I will say the primary brewery experiences are a little bit of a hike from the major tourist areas. They're in sort of the further out neighborhoods from that sort of capital area. So that's going to be a place that you're going to want to Uber. But we found quite a good bar called Triple Crossing. And it's known primarily for its pills and its light lagers. It does have hazy IPAs, but I, as a New Englander, a New England IPA, I believe belongs in New England, not below the Mason-Dixon line.
I thought the beer was pretty good. I enjoyed it. I'm a wee bit skeptical of the amount of breweries that are in the United States right now.
Yes.
But it felt like, we went kind of right before closing, but I can imagine during a game or something, that is a pretty exciting place to hang out. It's a cool space. It seems like, people would have a good time there.
Yeah, totally. I think these are just great hangout spots in a city that has a really great climate. So if you want to go out and find a beer garden, there are plenty to have in Richmond. Though we went at night, Triple Crossing did have a really nice outdoor area too.
Oh, definitely. And then after you went to bed because you had a 3 a.m. flight on Monday morning.
I had to wake up at 3 a.m.
Right.
The flight was until 6. But it got bumped to 8, but they said you still have to show up at 4.
I've never gotten to a flight 4 hours before, flying across the world, and alone from Richmond to Boston. I went out and I had a drink at a gay bar called Barcode. Great name for a bar. Mm-hmm. Sort of right in the capital area. I could walk from the hotel, and it was a Sunday night, but it was pretty poppin'. Good kind of diverse, interesting crowd. Some good music playing. I didn't fall in love, but I did get a chance to sort of chat with some of the locals, and it's definitely, from what I can tell, one of the more sort of popular gay bars in town, and it's sort of right in the center there. So if you're looking for a drink, it definitely was the place to be.
And did you mostly just go out to a corner with your phone, or did you strike up some chats with the locals?
I did. I chatted a little bit, with a couple of the folks around me. Everybody was very nice. It's Richmond, sort of remind me of Club Cafe in Boston in a way.
Okay.
I like it's just fun to go to smaller town gay bars because
Sure.
New York is so, it's so New York. Everyone's so nice outside of the city. So, that was fun, and I almost wish I had checked it out on Friday night, but I was too busy boarding and deboarding and deplaning.
Several times over.
Yeah. But I think you and I we had a good time in Richmond, and there was even stuff we didn't get to, and
yes, there was a Poe garden. Edgar Allan Poe was a journalist in Richmond. I regret that we didn't go to that one. That's probably my biggest reason to go back.
Yeah, that, and I'd go back for some of those tapas.
Absolutely, and some of the tacos. But Ryan, we don't have time for that right now. What we have time for is the last stop.
The last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
Well, Ryan, we're here having wrapped up. I'm feeling a little emotional that we're now past the full Richmond experience. I've had this recording on my mind to keep it alive, but we're going to have to put it to bed. So, Ryan, thank you for taking that trip together. I think it's time for us to start talking about getting another one on the book soon.
I would love that. I think that'd be a blast.
But for now, we are here in the last stop. This is the last segment of the show. That's why it's called The Last Stop. It's my favorite segment. It's your favorite segment. It's popularly known as the People's segment. This is a moment where we welcome our listenership in to get a little cozier. You know, it's not just us talking at you. I mean, it is just us talking at you, but it gets a little deeper. We like to share a piece of ourselves here in this final segment of the show. And it gives you a snapshot of what travel things we're doing. Maybe we're dreaming of our next trip. Maybe we're reminiscing about a past trip. We might be diving deep into a topic that is inspiring new places that we want to go. Or maybe we just came upon a photo that triggered an anecdote that we'd like to share here on the podcast. But anything we share here has to fit one criterion, which is this. It has to inspire the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workday week. Right, Ryan? I think you know that by now.
Oh, I know.
So I'm going to ask you now, as I ask you every episode, did you bring a last stop this week?
Yes. So I have begun planning my December vacation to Panama.
Oh, yeah. Very jealous of this.
Yeah. And there's a canal there. It's funny because when you do you start to do the research, we're going to go to Panama City. We're going to bounce around to a couple of other cities, looking forward to unpacking that on the show. But when you do your Panama City research, the amount of Panama Canal related tourist spots, it's really something. So excited for that. We just watched The Tailor of Panama a couple nights ago, which I had never seen, to sort of get in the mood. Have you ever seen The Tailor of Panama?
No, I haven't. I
think you would enjoy it. Jeffrey Rush, and it's about a tailor who inadvertently gets kind of pulled into a spy ring.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, and it's sort of a comedy. It's got kind of a dark kind of humor.
Is this an American-made film?
It is an American film. Yeah.
Interesting. How long ago?
I think it's like in the 90s.
No, I've just got terrible movie knowledge, but this one sounds promising.
Yeah, it's 2001, and it is Pierce Bronson and Jeffrey Rush, Jamie Lee Curtis. So you got a great cast.
Pierce Bronson.
Yeah. What did I say?
Judy, do you see what I'm dealing with here? I know you don't like when I correct dear Ryan, our boy.
I don't like lesser bonds, okay? So I'm happy to...
It's Brosnan.
Brosnan.
You got it. Pierce Brosnan.
I just call him Pierce.
Sure.
Handsome man. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed that before.
I liked him as a Bond. He's the Bond we grew up with.
And that's why I didn't like Bond until Daniel Craig came and saved the series. But let's not go there.
For a separate time. I like a Bond theme episode. That's not a bad idea.
Yeah, not a bad idea. Go to London. So yeah, I'm super excited about Panama. And we'll be unpacking on the show, some of the stuff that we get to see. But if you have suggestions for Panama City or around the surrounding area, let me know.
What's the best way for them to do that? Either presumably the
Instagram OOO podcast.
That's right. At OOO podcast, like out of office, or like, podcast.
Ooh, a podcast.
I always like, Ryan, you're very good about trying to immerse yourself in popular culture about the place that you're going. And it's very cool, even, a month plus out, you've started that journey with Panama.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of books on the shelf here, and it's there's a lot to learn. So it's always it's good to use your travel as an excuse to learn about a place you might not learn about otherwise. So Panama, here I come. Did you happen to bring a last stop, Kieran?
I did, but Ryan, I do want to just plug. I'm going to have a lot of Theodore Roosevelt related questions when you get back. All right.
TR is Panama is a Panama connection there.
That's right. There's got to be a lot about him. I would bet in a good and in a bad way. So as a TED head myself, and I know you are as well, I expect that to be the detail in the recap episode.
Oh, most definitely. We'll do a whole TR segment.
Yes, my last stop this week, I'm super pumped. I remember having this feeling when TR's house, Sagamore Hill, reopened after a major renovation, because it's a historical house I was hungry to get out to, and you and I took a trip out there shortly after it reopened. Well, wouldn't you know it, there's a new historical house it's an old historical house. That's what makes it a historical house. But there's a historical house that has recently been refurbished top to bottom out in Amherst, Massachusetts, and it is Emily Dickinson's house. And pretty fascinating to look at. There's a good New York Times article about it that I'll drop in the show notes. But do you remember there was like an Apple TV show about Emily Dickinson a few years ago?
I do not remember that. Is it like it was like Brigington or something? It was like sort of.
Yeah, it was it did have sort of a Bridgerton sort of feel. It was just called Dickinson, and I didn't watch it, but I think it was sort of like they gave modern dialogue to the Emily Dickinson's time, and it was a little bit tongue in cheek. I think it was sort of in the realm of that like Catherine the Great sort of series, and what was interesting was it was popular enough that Emily Dickinson just kind of caught on. It kind of reemerged into the popular zeitgeist for a while. But it also brought some attention to what the house was being presented out in Amherst, it is kind of a tired, colorless, washed out New England historic house, and it spurred the staff there to bring in more vibrant color that's probably truer to what it looked like when Emily Dickinson famously lived in this house for her whole life. And so they've reopened the doors, and it looks absolutely beautiful from the carpets to the wallpaper to the lamps. They've really tried to recapture some of the realistic magic of some of the realistic experience of when people were actually in the space. And the Apple show even donated some of the furniture from their historical research and the props to the house. So they're actually there and you can experience them.
Oh, I love that. Instead of wasting all the stuff like they usually do, they people are going to get to, it's going to get to add to the house. That's great news.
Exactly right. Yeah. And another interesting factoid here is that there's two houses on the site. One is called the Homestead. That's the primary house that we associate with Emily Dickinson. The other is called Evergreens, and it's on an adjacent plot of land. And it was supposed to be torn down. It was originally built for Emily Dickinson's brother and his family. But his widow did not want Amherst College to get a hold of it because the article says that she was fearful that it would end up covered in Amherst football gear, because I guess the college has a history of taking some of these grand old stately houses and turning them into fraternity houses.
Ha! I've never been to Amherst.
Oh, really? Oh, we should go visit. My wife's family has a long history there. So maybe we could go check this house out together next time you're up in Mass. Yeah, I would love that. That would be a fun thing to do. It's going on the list. Well, Ryan, what are we talking about next week? Well, next week is a return trip to an episode about Gaudi's. Gaudi's Barcelona. Yeah, which is one of our early hit episodes, and it's really, gosh, just even thinking about it makes me want to get back to Spain. So I'm really excited to share listeners on this episode, which they might have missed. And then on the 29th, in two weeks from now, we're going to do Ascension, Paraguay. Oh, perfect. Which you were just recently in. I know, which is going to be a really interesting episode. A lot to talk about. It's an interesting, it's quite an interesting place. So listeners will find out what I discovered about Paraguay when I was there, and looking forward to that. We are really stacking up the Spanish-speaking locations. Soon we're going to have to do a complimentary Spanish translation of the episodes. I am 30 days into my Duolingo. I got my 30-day chip today. They don't call it a chip, but I do. So excited about that. So maybe I'll bring some of that to this episode. And where does that put us on the vocabulary front? Tens of words at least. Tens of words. Just hit us with one word. One word? Yeah, just pagar. Your favorite one right now. Pagar. Pagar, to pay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I know your boys like to hit you up with the pagar. That's the reason they talk to you.
All right. Well, Kiernan, and until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken. Ryan, do you know my favorite Spanish word?
No?
Albóndiga.
What's that mean?
It means meatball. And I like it because it sounds like a meatball bouncing off the floor. Albóndiga.
Albóndiga. That's a good one. I'm going to put that on my list.
Okay.